Ahead, the road curved sharply, but the driver couldn't slow down. The bus tilted dangerously as it rounded the bend, and Adama could see the edge of the road drop into a deep ravine. "God, help us," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. When the bus straightened out again, Adama opened her eyes and saw something terrifying. A massive tanker truck was coming toward them on the narrow road. Its headlights were bright, and it looked like it took up the entire road. "Driver, look ahead!" someone shouted. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, and Mr. Chukwudi's house was full of excitement. The children ran around, laughing and shouting as they got ready for their yearly trip to the village in Anambra state. This trip was always the best part of the year for them. "Can I take my football, Mama?" Tochukwu, the oldest son, asked, holding his ball. "Yes, you can," Adama said with a smile, "but don't forget your slippers this time." The kids loved everything about the village: the fresh air, the big trees, and playing with their cousins. Every day was fun there. They swam in the river, climbed trees, and roasted corn by the fire with their grandparents. Adama, their mother, sat on the floor, packing their things. She was folding clothes and putting snacks in bags. She liked to be ready for anything. Snacks for the journey? Packed. Extra clothes? Packed. First aid box? Packed. Adama always made sure nothing was forgotten. But there was one thing she couldn't control. Her husband, Mr. Chukwudi, didn't believe in praying before traveling. "Chukwudi," she said, looking at him, "let's pray for just 2 minutes before we finish packing." Chukwudi was sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone. He laughed and waved his hand. "Adama, why do we need to pray? God already knows we're traveling. We'll be fine." Adama sighed. She didn't want to argue, but his attitude worried her. Even worse, the children were starting to copy him. One morning, as Adama knelt to pray, Tochukwu frowned and asked, "Mama, why do we have to pray every day? Nothing bad ever happens to us." "Praying is boring," Kamsi, his younger sister, added, dragging her feet to the prayer mat. Adama felt sad, but she didn't stop praying. Every day she asked God to protect her family. She wished her husband would join her, even just once, but she didn't say anything. One evening, Chukwudi was driving home from work. The traffic was bad, and he couldn't wait to be home. As he drove, he thought about their trip to the village. He imagined the village square full of people preparing for Christmas. He could almost smell the jollof rice and hear the laughter of his family. Suddenly, as he turned a corner onto a quieter road, he saw an old man standing by the side of the street. The man was small and dressed in simple clothes. He looked tired and out of place next to the busy road. The old man raised his hand to wave down Chukwudi's car. Chukwudi slowed down and stopped. He rolled down his window. "My son," the old man said in a soft voice, "I'm going to the next village. Can you help me?" Chukwudi thought for a moment. Then he nodded and unlocked the car door. The old man climbed in, holding a small bag. The drive was quiet at first. The old man didn't say much, and Chukwudi didn't feel like talking either. But after a while, the old man spoke in a serious voice. "This Christmas," he said, "you shouldn't travel to your village. If you must go, you and your family need to pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Chukwudi frowned. "Danger? What kind of danger?" The old man looked at him with calm but serious eyes. "Just remember my words," he said. Chukwudi didn't know what to think. He had traveled to the village every year, and nothing bad had ever happened. So he laughed. "We'll be fine," he said. A few minutes later, the old man asked to be dropped off at a small junction. Chukwudi pulled over, and the old man got out, thanked him, and walked away into the shadows. Chukwudi watched him leave, a strange feeling growing in his chest. When Chukwudi got home that night, the house was lively as usual. The children were running around, chasing each other and laughing. Tochukwu was trying to grab a piece of bread from Kamsi, who was giggling and holding it high above her head. "Leave your sister alone, Tochukwu!" Adama called from the kitchen, where she was preparing dinner. The smell of fried plantains and stew filled the air. Chukwudi opened the door and stepped inside. Normally, he would smile, greet the kids, and maybe join in their games for a few minutes. But tonight, he barely glanced at them. His shoulders seemed slumped, and there was a strange look on his face, like he was deep in thought about something. Adama peeked out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She noticed his expression right away. "You're back," she said warmly. "How was your day?" Chukwudi nodded. "It was fine," he said quickly, avoiding her eyes. He walked over to the couch, dropped his bag, and sat down heavily. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the floor, lost in his thoughts. The children didn't notice anything unusual. Tochukwu finally managed to grab the bread from Kamsi and ran off, laughing. Kamsi chased after him, shouting, "Mama, Tochukwu took my bread." "Leave her alone, Tochukwu," Adama scolded again as she placed the last bowl of stew on the table. She walked into the living room and stood in front of her husband. "Chukwudi," she said, her voice softer now. "What's wrong? You seem quiet." Chukwudi looked up at her, hesitating for a moment. "Nothing, Adama. I'm just tired," he said, forcing a small smile. But Adama knew her husband too well. His tiredness didn't explain why he looked so troubled. She sat down next to him and placed a hand on his arm. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "You've barely said a word since you came in. Did something happen at work?" "No, it's nothing like that," Chukwudi replied quickly, shaking his head. He tried to sound convincing, but the words felt hollow even to him. Adama didn't push further, but her worry grew. "All right," she said finally. "Dinner is ready. Come and eat. Maybe you'll feel better after some food." Chukwudi nodded again, but his movements were slow, like his mind was somewhere else. As they sat at the dining table, Adama kept stealing glances at him. Normally, he would joke with the kids or tell her about his day, but tonight he was unusually quiet. As they sat at the dining table, Adama couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Normally, Chukwudi would make funny remarks to get the kids laughing, or share stories about his day at work. Tonight, however, he just poked at his food and gave half-hearted responses whenever the children tried to include him in their conversations. "Papa Tochukwu," Adama said softly, using his nickname. "Are you sure everything is all right? You've barely eaten." Chukwudi glanced up at her and forced a smile. "I'm fine, Adama," he said, his tone light but unconvincing. "Just a lot on my mind." Adama studied him for a moment but decided not to push him any further. "All right," she said, though the worry in her heart remained. After dinner, Chukwudi went straight to their bedroom, leaving Adama to clean up and get the kids ready for bed. Tochukwu and Kamsi eventually settled down, and the house grew quiet. Once everything was done, Adama entered their bedroom to find Chukwudi lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She sat beside him and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Chukwudi," she said softly, "whatever it is, you can talk to me. We're in this together." Chukwudi sighed heavily. He wanted to tell her about the old man and the strange warning, but a part of him felt silly. What if it was nothing? What if he was overthinking? "I'll be fine," he said finally. "Don't worry about me." Adama nodded, though her heart was far from at ease. Later that night, as Chukwudi slept restlessly, Adama knelt by her bedside, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "please protect us on this journey. Keep my husband and children safe. Whatever is weighing on Chukwudi's heart, give him peace. And Lord, surround us with your protection against anything that may come our way." The room was silent, except for her whispered prayers. Adama didn't know what was troubling Chukwudi, but she trusted God to guide and protect her family. As she finished and climbed into bed, she looked at her husband, still frowning in his sleep. A wave of unease washed over her, but she pushed it aside. "Everything will be okay," she told herself. Little did she know just how much her prayers would be needed in the days to come. The day of the journey finally came. The air was buzzing with excitement as Mr. Chukwudi and his family arrived at the bustling motor park. Vendors shouted, offering everything from roasted plantains to bottles of cold water. Buses honked, passengers argued over seats, and children cried as their parents tried to keep them in check. Adama held tightly to her youngest daughter, Kamsi, while her other two children, Tochukwu and Nonso, ran ahead, eager to explore. Mr. Chukwudi, carrying a bag over his shoulder, looked relaxed. He smiled as he greeted a few people he recognized. "Chukwudi? Nawao," one of his friends called out. "You still dey use this old bus? No big man ride yet?" "Leave my old bus alone," Chukwudi replied, laughing. "It's been carrying me and my family for years." The children climbed into the bus first, quickly grabbing window seats. Adama was next, carefully placing their bags under the seats while keeping an eye on the kids. Before boarding, she took a moment to pray quietly, her lips moving as she whispered for safety. "Lord, cover us on this journey. Watch over the driver and everyone on this bus," she prayed. When everyone was settled, the driver started the engine, and the bus roared to life. The family waved goodbye to the city as the bus pulled onto the highway, beginning their long journey to Anambra State. At first, the trip seemed fine. The children were excited, pointing out things they saw outside the window. Tochukwu spotted cows grazing in a field and shouted, "Mama, look, there are cows over there." "Is that a monkey in the tree?" Kamsi asked, pressing her face to the window. "That's not a monkey," Tochukwu teased. "It's just a big bird." Kamsi frowned, but her annoyance didn't last long. Adama smiled and handed out the snacks she had packed, meat pies and juice. The children quickly became quiet, happily munching on their food. The bus rolled through the countryside, where the roads became narrower and bumpier. The driver turned up the radio, and cheerful music filled the air. Some passengers nodded along to the tunes, while others leaned back in their seats, trying to nap. Mr. Chukwudi leaned against the window, closed his eyes, and dozed off. Adama, however, couldn't relax. At first, Adama thought she was just tired. She had stayed up late the night before, finishing their packing. But as the bus drove on, she began to feel uneasy. Her heart raced, and her palms felt sweaty for no reason. She glanced at her children, who were happily eating their snacks, and felt slightly calmer. Then she looked around the bus. An elderly woman was knitting quietly in her seat. A man with headphones was nodding his head to the music. A mother cradled her sleeping baby. Everything seemed normal, yet Adama couldn't shake the bad feeling in her chest. "What's wrong with me?" she thought. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on the scenery outside. But the uneasiness only grew. The driver suddenly slowed down, and the bus jerked forward slightly. Adama sat up straight and looked ahead. A broken-down truck was blocking part of the road. The truck was leaning to one side with a flat tire. "Be careful!" someone shouted from the back of the bus. The driver carefully steered around the truck, but the side of the bus came dangerously close to the edge of the road. Adama held her breath, gripping the seat in front of her as she watched the tires skid along the gravel at the edge of a deep ditch. When the bus finally passed the truck and returned to the center of the road, a few passengers let out sighs of relief. "That was close," someone muttered, but Adama's bad feeling only got worse. She turned to the driver. "Are we safe? Is the bus okay?" The driver didn't even look back. "Madam, the bus is fine," he said quickly. "Don't worry yourself." Adama tried to believe him, but something in his voice didn't sound confident. As the bus continued, a faint screeching noise started coming from underneath. Adama's ears perked up immediately. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, looking around. A man sitting across the aisle frowned. "I think I heard something," he said, leaning forward to listen. The screeching sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low rattling noise. It sounded like metal was grinding against metal. "Driver, what's that noise?" Adama asked. The driver waved her off. "It's just the road," he said. "These roads are full of potholes." Adama wasn't convinced. She glanced at the other passengers, but most of them didn't seem worried. "Maybe I'm imagining things," she thought. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Minutes later, without warning, the driver slammed on the brakes. The bus screeched loudly and jerked forward, throwing everyone against their seats. "What's going on?" a man in the back shouted. "The brakes aren't working," the driver yelled. Adama's heart dropped. The bus started swerving from side to side as the driver struggled to keep control. Passengers screamed and held onto their seats. Some prayed loudly, while others just cried. Adama wrapped her arms around Tochukwu and Kamsi, pulling them close to her chest. "It's okay," she whispered, even though her voice was shaking. "Everything will be okay." But it wasn't okay. The bus kept gaining speed, and the driver's panicked shouts made it clear that he had no control. Ahead, the road curved sharply, but the driver couldn't slow down. The bus tilted dangerously as it rounded the bend, and Adama could see the edge of the road drop into a deep ravine. "God, help us," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. When the bus straightened out again, Adama opened her eyes and saw something terrifying. A massive tanker truck was coming toward them on the narrow road. Its headlights were bright, and it looked like it took up the entire road. "Driver, look ahead!" someone shouted. The driver gripped the wheel tightly, trying to steer the bus to one side, but the brakes still weren't working. The bus kept speeding forward, the screeching noise now louder than ever. "Jesus, take control!" Adama cried out, tears streaming down her face. Passengers screamed louder. Some held hands, others hugged their loved ones, and a few froze, too scared to move. The tanker grew closer and closer. Adama held onto her children as tightly as she could. The bus hit a large pothole, sending it swerving to the side, but it wasn't enough to avoid the tanker. There was a loud, deafening crash. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the impact sent passengers flying from their seats. For a few seconds, everything was chaotic. Screams, the sound of breaking glass, and the screeching of metal on metal. Then, suddenly, it all went silent. Adama's arms were still wrapped around her children, her body trembling. She opened her eyes slowly, too scared to look around. The silence after the crash was deafening. Back in the village, Namdi, Mr. Chukwudi's uncle, sat in his compound, waiting. His face was calm, but his heart was full of bitterness. Every year, he had watched his nephew return to the village, flaunting his success. The shiny car, the expensive gifts, the happy family. It was too much for Namdi to bear. "This year will be different," he had told himself. A few weeks earlier, Namdi had visited a spiritualist deep in the forest. The spiritualist, an old woman with piercing eyes, had listened as he poured out his frustrations. "I want them to suffer," Namdi had said, his voice low and filled with hatred. "I want their happiness to end." The spiritualist had nodded, collecting items for the ritual. A piece of cloth from Chukwudi's last visit, herbs, and other strange objects. She chanted in a language Namdi didn't understand, her voice echoing through the dark forest. "It is done," she finally said. "But remember, every action has a price." Now, as Namdi sat waiting for news, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. At the crash site, emergency workers arrived quickly. They pulled passengers from the wreckage, checking for signs of life. Miraculously, Adama and her children were completely unharmed, not even a scratch on them. It was as if an invisible shield had protected them. Mr. Chukwudi, however, was not as lucky. He had been sitting near the front of the bus, and his legs were badly injured. He was rushed to the hospital, unconscious and barely alive. In the chaos, Adama couldn't stop thanking God. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered over and over, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Chukwudi lay in the hospital bed, his legs bandaged and his body weak. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the machines around him. Adama sat beside him, holding his hand and silently praying. The children were in another room, safe and being cared for by a nurse. Mr. Chukwudi opened his eyes slowly. "Adama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," she said, leaning closer. Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "You're alive, Chukwudi. Thank God you're alive." He tried to speak again, but before he could say more, the door creaked open. Standing there was the old man who had warned him before the journey. His expression was calm but serious, and his presence filled the room with a strange sense of peace. "Do you remember me?" the old man asked, stepping closer to the bed. "Yes," Mr. Chukwudi said, his voice trembling. "You told me not to travel without praying." The old man nodded. "And now you see why. Your wife's prayers saved you and your family. Without her faith, things would have been much worse." Adama looked at the old man in surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked. The old man took a deep breath. "Someone planned this. Someone didn't want your family to make it to the village alive." Mr. Chukwudi's eyes widened. Who would do such a thing? Why? The old man hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Back in your village, there is someone who has been consumed by jealousy. They went to great lengths to ensure your downfall, but their plans failed because of your wife's constant prayers." Adama gasped. "Jealousy? From who?" The old man didn't answer directly. "The truth will reveal itself in time. But for now, focus on healing. Your journey isn't over." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving more questions than answers. Meanwhile, back in the village, Namdi was growing restless. He had expected to hear news of a tragedy by now, but instead, there was silence. He hadn't heard anything about Chukwudi's family or their journey. Anxiety gnawed at him. One evening, as he sat in his compound, he overheard neighbors whispering. "Did you hear about Chukwudi's accident? It was terrible," one woman said. "Yes, but somehow his wife and children survived without a scratch," another replied. "Only Chukwudi was hurt. It's a miracle." Namdi's heart sank. The plan hadn't worked as he had hoped. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him, but he quickly pushed it aside. "That old woman must have done something wrong," he muttered to himself, referring to the spiritualist he had visited. The guilt grew heavier each day. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and he avoided talking to anyone. Even his closest friend, Papa Emeka, noticed the change in him. "Enamdi, what's wrong with you?" Papa Emeka asked one day. "Nothing," Enamdi snapped, but his voice betrayed his unease. Back in the hospital, Mr. Chukwudi began to recover slowly. He needed multiple surgeries on his legs, and the doctors warned him that he might never walk the same way again. Despite the challenges, Adama stayed by his side, encouraging him every step of the way. One morning, as he sat in his wheelchair, Mr. Chukwudi looked at his wife with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," he said. "I should have prayed with you. I should have listened. You've been protecting this family all along." Adama smiled gently. "It's never too late to start, Chukwudi. What matters is that we're alive, and God has given us another chance." From that day on, Mr. Chukwudi became a changed man. Every morning, he was the first to call the family together for prayers. He taught the children to pray, explaining why it was important to trust in God. A few months later, when Mr. Chukwudi had recovered enough to travel, the family decided to visit the village. It wasn't Christmas anymore, but they wanted to reconnect with their extended family and thank God for sparing their lives. When they arrived, the entire village gathered to welcome them. The elders praised God for their survival, calling it a miracle. But in the crowd, Namdi stood at the back, his face pale and his heart racing. Later that evening, Mr. Chukwudi asked to see Namdi. They sat together in the compound, the air tense between them. "I know what you did," Mr. Chukwudi said quietly. Namdi's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't deny it anymore. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I let jealousy take over my heart. I thought if you were gone, my pain would end. But I was wrong." Instead of anger, Mr. Chukwudi reached out and placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder. "I forgive you, Namdi. Holding on to bitterness will only destroy you. Let's move forward as a family." That night, the family gathered for prayers, joined by Namdi and many other relatives. It was the first time in years that they had all come together as one. The old man who had warned Mr. Chukwudi appeared again, standing quietly in the shadows. He watched as the family prayed and smiled. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. From that day on, the Chukwudi family lived differently. They learned to trust in God, to pray together, and to let go of jealousy and bitterness. As for Namdi, he changed too. He became kinder and more humble, using his time to support others in the village. Though the journey had been difficult, it brought the family closer and reminded them of the power of faith, forgiveness, and unity. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, please let me know in the comments below by typing "continue." I'd love to hear what you learned from this story. Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends. And if you haven't already, subscribe to stay updated with all the new chapters coming your way. Your support means the world to me. See you next time.